Hello and welcome to ILTV's Elections Arena. I'm Aaron Porras, and today in the ring, the Likud party prepares to face down what may be its biggest scandal yet. And then later, we'll take a look at the latest polling numbers ahead of the coming March 2nd elections, and we'll be breaking down those statistics. But joining us to discuss is Mark Schulman, columnist for Newsweek and editor of HistoryCentral.com, and Ruthie Bloom, journalist and columnist for the Jerusalem Post and the Jewish National Syndicate. Thank you both so much for being with us today. Let's go on to our first topic. So, just 3 weeks remain now before Israel returns to yet another national election, the third in 11 months. And the Prime Minister's Likud party is now embroiled in scandal. But no, I'm not referring to the indictments against Netanyahu. I'm talking about what's being referred to as the most, quote, absurdly incompetent and damaging violation of privacy laws in Israel's history. I'm talking about how the Likud is now being petitioned against for leaking to the public the names, sex, phone numbers, addresses, and even voting habits of every single Israeli adult of voting age. So, Mark, let's start with you. Now, we know that this happened through a bad app that the Likud has been working with to collect data on Israelis ahead of the election. How could this happen, though?
Okay, first of all, it can happen in any situation. As soon as you put information in a place where it can be gotten, it's hackable.
So how? But that's what I'm saying. Like, how is that even allowed
because
to occur?
No one was thinking about it. No one was giving it the thought that's necessary. None of them came out of the part of the army that worries about these sort of things. They just did it. I mean, think about it. Not the last campaign, the campaign before that, they spent half the campaign talking about Gantz's phone that was hacked. And here they did something where they hacked, or someone could hack the whole database of all Israelis. Probably, like you said, the worst hack in history in terms of what's possible here. And again, it's thoughtfulness. They're just not thinking. They think, what can I best do in order to make my life easier? How can I reach as many voters as possible? Forget about the consequences.
But isn't there some sort of oversight, like, you know, in the elections committee that tries to prevent this sort of thing?
Oh, come on. That's like asking what happened with the Democratic Party in Iowa and their app, okay? But, you know, you should understand that among the details that were so-called leaked, I mean, it wasn't purposefully leaked like that, all right.
So there were actually
but
apparently two sides
Prime
to this
Minister
leak.
Netanyahu's details are also on there, and his family's details. So it's not only, you know, some kind of targeting of the enemy, so to speak.
No,
okay?
it was gross negligence, but there was
correct.
also a part of it, according to this petition, that was intentional, because a part of it involved enabling people who did not have access to this sort of data and should not have had access to this data, access to the data in order to, you know, mobilize their activists. So, I mean, there must have been someone somewhere along the way.
Let's look at it this way. Lines in these elections have been crossed time and time again, and especially more recently by the Likud party, who's getting more and more frantic at this point. So any sort of advantage they could get, they'll make use of, and, you know, forget the consequences. No one's thinking about the consequences. And look, what's also clearly been the case in these last couple of elections is no one has said, well, what are the consequences of what I've done the day after? The most important thing is to get to the election day, get as many votes as possible, and whatever comes afterwards, comes afterwards. As they say in Hebrew, Acharei ha-mabul, in this case, after the election is the mabul, and so they'll have to deal with the consequences. They should pay a price.
Well, so that's kind of my next question, is that, you know, who is to answer for this? Like,
Nobody. Listen, nobody in this country almost ever pays the price. The most recent person to ever pay the price was the commander of the Air Force Base in Chatzor, who actually completed his job early because of the flooding that took place in the base, but didn't really pay the price because he's going on to be a military attaché somewhere else. So the reality is, in this country, no one pays a price for their mistakes if they work for the government.
Okay, now that's true, and that has nothing to do with the Likud. That's always been true in Israel, and there's another thing that's always been true in Israel. Alongside Israel's genuinely being the startup nation and inventing brilliant patents of all kinds, it is also filled with incompetent people. And even the same people who are brilliant in many areas are completely incompetent in others. And this goes back to how this could happen with an app. You know, Israelis could invent an app and then somebody
but giving administrative access to the whole database to the public.
Correct. That's correct. But then the question, but what you really want to know is, okay, so what happens now, and will this have an effect on the outcome of the election that it's taking place in, 3 weeks? It's my sense, in spite of or because of polls and in spite of other polls, that actually nothing that has happened in the last few weeks is going to affect the vote. Now, I could be wrong, but let's say I'm not. Let's say that actually we're going to end up in a similar impasse to the one that we had in September. That is because what most voters are not changing their votes they haven't changed their position on what party they're voting for. And what that does is explain or helps to refute the left's claim that Trump's plan being unveiled before the election and Netanyahu's trying to capitalize on it are going to affect the election. In fact, what we've seen is the only thing that seems will affect the election is voter turnout.
I think that I'm not positive about that in the sense that, look, one of the things that Netanyahu has been claiming all along, one of the reasons he gets the vote he gets is competence, right? So people say, I trust him because he's competent, leaving aside the politics for a moment, there's a certain level of competency that he's certainly shown over the last 10 or 11 years and how he's administered things, etc. I think this puts another chip into the armor of competency of the Likud, and by its nature, the head of the Likud is also responsible, whether you like it or not, the buck has to stop somewheres. And so we're seeing, I think, slowly the sense of looking at the blue and white party and looking at the generals, et cetera. It's not, they're serious people, and people are saying, well, maybe they're competent enough that if Likud really is as incompetent as it seems, maybe I'll give them a chance. Maybe I'll give them a choice, and there's a choice here now to be made. How big an impact that'll have? I don't think it alone has an impact, but I think the combination of various factors sort of adds to the level of feeling, well, maybe he's not all as competent as he makes out to be at the moment. Maybe he's losing some of it. And I think that's where the negative lies here right now in this, because it's another fashla, it's another big mistake, and another big mistake is the last thing he needs right now.
But that works both ways. In the months that have passed since the first round and second round of the elections, Gantz and his blue and white people in his party have also exhibited all kinds of, I wouldn't, not necessarily incompetence because they're not in the ruling party. But one of the things this week, no, not even oversight, but, bad politics and reminding the public that A, they don't agree with one another on many important policies, and B, what just recently happened with the Supreme Court overturning a decision to allow an Arab Knesset member who, let's say, mourned the killing of Soleimani, the Iranian terror chief, Soleimani. So she's running in the elections, and one of the things that we see on the political map in the elections is that the Arab parties are, in order for Gantz to have a majority or even equal the right wing, he's got to count the number of Arab Knesset members in that bloc. So I wouldn't say that the Likud has shown itself to be worse than blue and white by any means. And in fact, Netanyahu has been a great statesman, and and his trip to Washington shows that it's not clear that Trump would have that kind of rapport with Benny Gantz.
Well, we're gonna get into the polls in just a minute, but you've touched on another topic that I think is really important, and that is that a lot of Israelis are losing more and more trust of not just the government but the democratic process in Israel. And this scandal seems to speak to that. And the cynic in me wants to say maybe it was on purpose to break the public from even more.
Look, there is something to be said for that. There was a survey recently that just came out last day or two. The percentage of people who have no trust in the legal system has skyrocketed ever since the Netanyahu trial, or not the trial, but the indictment and everything else has begun, because that's been an orchestrated campaign by Likud and by Netanyahu to undermine all aspects of the judiciary. And so it works to some extent. You undermine the judiciary, you undermine democracy.
Do you think that this
this is not on purpose. This was too stupid. I'm sorry. This was just too stupid. But it shows a level of incompetence at this point that is unheard of, really. I mean,
or negligence, if anything.
Well, negligence and incompetence is the same thing when it comes to data security. Listen, there are laws of data security. People know what you're supposed to do to keep data secure. Certainly this country knows 100% the people who need to keep data secure are keeping the real data really secure. But, there was another little bit of a security breach this last 2 or 3 days that didn't get much talk, which was the fact that Netanyahu hinted that maybe we had something to do with what happened to the Iranian missile. Now, I don't know whether it's true or not.
To
but
the
Iranian
satellite that went
satellite
down. Now, if by chance we had something to do with it, which I have no way of knowing if that's true or not.
The full quote is it's very gray on that.
It's very gray, but
It's very gray
but he
on that.
shouldn't have said anything at all. Quiet is what you know what you need to do, because he was sort of taking a little bit of pleasure in saying it, but also taking maybe a little bit electoral. Look what I can do without quite saying it. And the reality is, I guarantee you that if we had anything to do with it, the people who had something to do with it were ready to go shoot him at that moment, the moment he said something, because those are things you just don't talk about. You're
Well,
quiet.
I mean, you also have Defense Minister Bennett, who just a few days ago essentially took credit for a military strike in Syria as well.
Right,
I mean,
of
is
course.
that not the same?
No, it's the same problem. It's a problem that we have a policy of not boasting about the things we've done. This goes all the way back to the 50s, frankly. The fact is,
But there has been a recent argument over that policy, particularly in the days of the internet, when
maybe we should be vocal as a deterrent.
when foreign,
but
Israeli Israeli journalists, say things like, according to the BBC, according to the Guardian. Israel attacked, according to Syrian news sources. So it becomes ridiculous almost that we've got to have this policy where we can't say something that the entire world has already said.
Except there's a difference, though, when it comes to it, because once you say that we've done it, then you're forcing the countries on the other side of this equation to say, wait, we have to retaliate for the action they said they did. If they can look the other way and say, well, we don't know, or they
You're
didn't
saying
claim...
the plausible deniability.
Plausible deniability is
There's
very
another
important.
way to look at it, too.
It's always been Israel's policy, and it's still its official policy. It's just that whenever it suits certain people politically, they've been crossing that line, and from what I've understood from the defense establishment, they have not been happy when that line has been crossed. Plausible deniability is the best and has always worked for Israel very well. I mean, look how long it took before we admitted we destroyed the Syrian atomic reactor.
Sure.
It was quiet. It was people talked about it, etc. But Syria didn't feel it had to try to retaliate because we didn't take responsibility for it. We all knew, but we didn't say.
Uti? Final
Well,
comment, and then we'll move on.
my comment is about the faith in the institutions such as the police. Before Netanyahu was accused of various crimes that I don't believe he committed in the first place, before that happened, the public had lost faith in the police long ago, and so had the Israeli media. Every 5 minutes, and even now, still now, anything that's not related to Netanyahu's indictments and is related to the police are gone after. They're incompetent, they're evil, they're corrupt, the Israeli public hates the police and did way before Netanyahu was indicted. I just want to make that clear. Sure. It's not true.
Yeah, final comment. I know I was going to move on, but those are strong comments.
I don't totally agree with that. I mean, I agree with the police. There's issues with the police, and there always have been issues with the police, but not against the whole judiciary. And it's been the whole system that Netanyahu has been fighting since it was clear he was going to be indicted.
All right, well, let's move on to our second topic of the day. The latest polls are now out following the release of the United States' Middle East peace plan, and the center-left Arab bloc under blue and white chairman Benny Gantz is now up to 59 seats. The right and religious bloc under incumbent Prime Minister Netanyahu, on the other hand, is down to 53, losing mandates both to the left and to Avigdor Lieberman's Israel Beitenu party, which is on the fence between them. They haven't decided who to vote for. Uti, I want to start with you now. Where are these results coming from? Because, this is... It's not a massive change,
actually
but
don't believe
it's
that.
a big change.
I don't happen to believe those results. Of course, I don't know, and we don't know. Polls are
polls
often
change.
inaccurate, and they change, and we don't know, okay? I don't happen to believe that poll, as I mentioned earlier, both anecdotally and otherwise, reading what everybody's saying, the same people are voting pretty much the same way. The difference in votes, I would say, is on the right, on the right side of the political spectrum. There are floaters occasionally between Likud and the religious parties or Naftali Bennett's Yamina party. There is a little bit of movement.
But the shifting between those parties doesn't really affect the bloc.
It doesn't affect the bloc, and that's why I don't actually believe that poll, but even, let's say it's true. If that's true, then what that means is that the hysteria on the left about Netanyahu's relations with Trump and the peace plan, then they should, then they were wrong to say that it was endangering their chances at the ballot box. If in fact Trump's plan increased their mandates, then they should shut up.
Two things. First of all, I mean, you can't necessarily believe any particular poll, but it is Camille Fuchs who's been right almost all the time. He's the most accurate of the pollsters.
That's true.
So that's number one. Number two, it continues what we saw. Don't forget, in the first election, the right religious had 60. In the second, 55. So now if it went to 53, it's continuing the same direction that it was going all along. And people said after the second election that they'll go down some more because more Likud voters are just going to stay home, possibly. Or going to just say enough.
So it's not a shift in politics of
No,
the
it's what I
individual.
said. It's turnout.
It's really just
It's
turnout.
turnout.
It's turnout. Now, number two, look, I agree with it. The center left doesn't have to be upset about the Trump plan from the sense that the whole thing blew up in Netanyahu's face. It turned out to be a disaster for Netanyahu on two levels. Number one, because he made all these grandiose statements and then was undermined a minute later by other people on the right who had to talk about, no, we'll accept part of this plan, we won't accept the other part of the plan. America put a brake on because some of these people just didn't know how to be quiet. I mean, if Bennett and Shaked would have just closed their mouths and not talked about the fact that we'll never accept the
Well, they're
Palestinians.
not really in a position to reject or accept it anyway.
Well, they are in a way because they form the majority of a government. In other words, if Shaked, let's assume for the sake of argument that Netanyahu was to form a government, a right government with Yamina, but then he would be dependent on their votes. And so he couldn't accept the whole Trump plan. Now, they went along and said, we'll take the good parts and we're not going to touch the bad parts. Now, whether you agree with that or not, from their perspective, they had to be quiet. They didn't have to say that publicly because what they were doing was spitting in the face of the Americans, basically. The Americans wanted a whole plan. That was the goal. So they wanted to take only the good part and not take the bad part from their perspective. And so the Americans said, stop. Wait, let's see what happens here. That was problem number one for Netanyahu. And the problem number two for Netanyahu is he thought he had totally boxed in Gantz by inviting him to come to be, sit in the room when he met with Trump. By Gantz arranging a separate meeting with Trump and have the pictures together with him and Trump together, suddenly it was, oh, wait a second. Gantz can also talk to Trump.
He came out statesman.
He came out as statesman.
as a
Trump had a
statesman.
big smile on his face. They looked like they were quite chummy and friendly. And the reality is, the word from Washington afterwards is that Trump liked Gantz. He likes generals,
Gantz
at least
has a
initially.
history in
Right.
D.C.
Right,
and-
yeah, he was the military attaché
Mm-hmm.
in Washington for 2 years. Supposedly, I didn't know that beforehand. He took a motorcycle trip from coast to coast by motorcycle to get to know America. So the man knows what
That's
he's
one way to
doing.
do it.
Yeah, absolutely. You see him in a leather jacket crossing America on a motorcycle. So the reality is, it suddenly elevated Gantz, and people said, wait a second, maybe Netanyahu is not the only person who can talk to the Americans.
See, where I agree with you and disagree with you. I agree with you that the people who are supporting Gantz saw his trip to Washington in a positive light, but those are people who were going to vote for him anyway. The far left is against Trump, not only against Netanyahu, and any of them join a coalition with Gantz are doing so holding their noses because they think Gantz is too right-wing. Just as Naftali Bennett and Ayelet Shaked came out and had to say, we'll only accept part of this plan and not the other part, what they were doing was appealing to their base. Okay, they were doing that for their political reasons at the ballot box. They weren't doing this in front of Trump. They were doing it to say to their voters, don't vote Likud, vote for us.
But is Mark right in the respect that was an offense to the Americans and ultimately may have cost the right votes?
No. Because what happened when Netanyahu, in a way, it wasn't Netanyahu's fault that he came out and said, okay, next week
we're
we
not
can
talking about
annex.
faults. We're just talking about the effect.
No, in the sense that he didn't shoot himself in the foot. I'll tell you what happened. What happened was that the Americans indicated to Netanyahu, this we know from statements made, for example, by the U.S. ambassador to Israel, that Israel could start to annex territory even before the Palestinians decided whether to reject or accept the plan. So Netanyahu, yes, to appeal to his base and hopefully to the right of his base, said, I'm going to do this next week or something. And then the Americans said to him, hold up a second, we don't want to do this piecemeal. Wait, we need to wait a few weeks. We're going to have committees to determine what we're negotiating, what stays and what goes. Because some points in that plan already appear to be to be not realistic even.
Well, and again,
Trump
I
has
mean,
accepted
I don't know
it.
how much
Doesn't
of that
matter.
is even relevant because the Palestinian Authority is refusing to come to the deal.
No, but you see, what's relevant about it is that the Americans are saying to the Palestinian Authority, this time, we don't care. You're ready, you're not ready. You've got 4 years to get your act together. And we're not going to reward you for being rejectionists. We are going to reward Israel that has proven itself to be a democracy, a Western democracy, and an ally, and all of those good things that you are not. We are going to reward Israel, and we're not going to reward you, and we will reward you if you accept and if you recognize Israel.
But what happened was Netanyahu got, as they say, ahead of his skis, so to speak. And by jumping in and saying we're going to annex right away, when the Americans really weren't ready for that, he used it for an election, of immediate election ploy. And the Americans weren't ready for the immediacy because they also were trying to bring along the Arab countries.
Could have waited until after the election.
Yes, but it doesn't matter.
It doesn't matter, though, because now he comes upon looking a bit foolish to the Israeli
But to
electorate.
whom?
The Israeli electorate.
But the Israeli right wasn't going to vote for Netanyahu anyway.
But there is the soft right that is, some of them are tired of the...
There are undecideds. There has to be
They're
undecideds
undecided.
as well.
They're the soft right that people who were saying, wait a second, I don't really want a prime minister who may be going to court for the next 2 years. I don't want a prime minister who we're not sure what his decisions are based on our needs or his needs. Maybe I'll give these other people a chance. I'm not exactly, like we said, Gantz is not a far left-winger. So I can vote for him. And I think to those people, Netanyahu came across as weak, ultimately.
All right. Well, I'm so sorry. We have to edit. This is a great conversation. I wish we could keep going, but unfortunately, that is it for this week's Elections Arena. I'd like to thank our guests, Ruthie Blue and Mark Schulman, for joining us. And of course, thanks to all of you for tuning in. Remember that for more news from ILTV, please follow us on Facebook, like us on Instagram, and subscribe to our YouTube and Roku TV pages. I'm Aaron Porras. See you next time.